We have been talking about prophets the last month or so here. We looked at the prophet Elijah. We talked about the prophet Amos. 2 weeks ago, we looked at the prophet Isaiah. These prophets were sent to try to turn the people, turn the kings especially, back to God. The consequence, they said, of not turning back to God would be the destruction of all that they held dear. Remember, 2 weeks ago, Isaiah warned the king of Judah that he was concerned about Israel, the kingdom to the north, that they were going to come and overrun them. But Isaiah gives him a sign. Remember, the sign says a child will be born. This child would be called Emmanuel, which means God will be with you. Sure enough, Israel was assimilated by the Assyrians, and Judah was spared. Unfortunately, the subsequent kings of Judah did not learn from Israel's mistake. Right? They turned away from God. So we're going to jump ahead about 150 years from the time when Isaiah was first speaking to Ahaz. And so 150 years later, the Babylonians rise, they come onto the scene, and they invade, and they destroy Jerusalem. And they take the brightest and the best, and they carry them back to Babylon to serve them there. They saw the human resource there as a wonderful gift to be able to use, and they would take them, so they took them back to use the best that they had in the country. Well, that's the setting for the story of Daniel. Daniel is a very sort of unique book in the Old Testament, and most likely the last book to be written in the Old Testament. Most scholars believe it probably wasn't written down to maybe 300-400 years after the events that it described. So why was that? Why wait 300-400 years to tell the stories of what happened? Maybe a little history will help. They're in captivity in Babylon for about 70 years. But after 70 years, what happens? Why did it only last 70 years? Well, the Persians came in, and they wiped out the Babylonians. And when they came, they said, what are you Hebrew people doing here? Why don't you go back home? And so the exiles were sent back home to live in Judah, those who wanted to go. Some stayed, but many decided they would go back to their home, even though it had been several generations since they had lived there. Eventually, the Persians, no empire lasts forever. Eventually, the Persians also, empire fell when Alexander the Great came swooping through. And the Greek culture then dominates that part of the world for centuries. That's why we have the New Testament is written in Greek. It's not written in Persian, not written in Babylonian, it's not written in Hebrew, because the Greeks were the one who were dominating the culture at the time for hundreds of years from this time forward up until the time of Jesus. So Alexander's kingdom, when he dies, he divides up, and he's got different governors who take different parts of his kingdom. And these were dark days for the people of God. Unlike the exile, where they were when they were taken, they were valued for their gifts. This was a brutal occupation. Where the Greeks came and they didn't see the people as gifts to be used. They were just fodder. They were just people. They ran roughshod over their beliefs, what they did, and so there's a great persecution under the Greeks for the Hebrew people. So how do you deal with that? How do you live when you have an oppressor who is just takes every puts down your culture, your language, everything? Part of what they did was to remember earlier generations when also things had looked bad, and so they looked back to the days of the exile. Now they'd been back, in Palestine for many years, but they remembered how did our ancestors survive when they were carried off into exile. Daniel then becomes this book of encouragement for Jewish people who are undergoing, a new generation who are undergoing persecution, to remember what was it like. Many ways, the book of Revelation serves in the same way for the early Christians. When they were undergoing persecution, they said, how do we, give us something to help us know how do we understand and how do we make it through a time of severe persecution. Now, when you're being persecuted by a ruthless enemy, it's difficult and dangerous to criticize them directly. And so what they did was told stories not about the awful Greeks who are oppressing us. They told stories about the Babylonians. All right? It was a little easier way to talk about their oppressors. It's sort of like, you guys, anyone remember the show MASH on TV? Right, MASH it came out right in the heart of the Vietnam conflict. But the show was immensely popular. But it wasn't because we were so fascinated with Korea, right? It was talking about how do we think about war? How do we think about the inhumanity or the things that can happen with that? It helped us understand our present reality by looking at an older story to do that. In many ways, that's how Daniel works as well. So under the thumb of the Greek occupation troops, they told stories of Babylon to encourage each other and to somehow get through this. So in the story, Daniel and his friends, probably the brightest and the best, are the first wave of exiles. There were several waves of exiles that went, but they were the best of the best. So they were taken first. They're taken to Babylon because they all had talents and skills, and they were trained to serve the king. Now again, we're going to find echoes in the Daniel story as we look back to Scripture, to this Joseph story. Remember Joseph being sold into slavery and being carried off to Egypt, and there ends up serving Pharaoh, right? But because he had an ability to interpret dreams, God gives him this gift to interpret dreams. He's given positions of power and influence. The same thing happens to Daniel. Only this time, instead of Egypt, it's Babylon. But he is given the gift to interpret dreams, and he rises to power. And King Nebuchadnezzar is impressed. He proclaims that Daniel's God is God above all gods, and he gives Daniel and his friends these important positions of power and influence. So, King Nebuchadnezzar, he says that Daniel's God is God above all gods. That's his big proclamation he makes after Daniel interprets the dreams for him very early in the book of Daniel. Now, either King Nebuchadnezzar has a very short memory, or he didn't really mean it, or he was just Fruit Loops crazy. And I think it was all the above, all right? That because in our story today, the third chapter, he completely seems to forget about what he learned about Daniel and Daniel's and what he proclaimed about the God of Daniel. So let's take a look. This is Daniel chapter 3. King Nebuchadnezzar ordered a gold statue to be built, 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. 90 feet tall is big. You know, this is maybe about 30 feet up here. So 3 times as tall as our church. This is a big statue, all right? He builds this, set it up in the Dura Valley near the city of Babylon, commanded his governors, advisors, treasurers, and judges, and all his officials to come from everywhere in his kingdom to the dedication of the statue. So they all came and stood in front of it. Then an official stood up and announced, "People of every nation and race, listen to the king's command. Trumpets, flutes, harps, and all kinds of musical instruments will soon start playing. When you hear the music, you must bow down and worship the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Anyone who refuses will be at once thrown into a flaming furnace." And as soon as the people heard the music, they bowed down. They worshiped the gold statue the king had set up. In other words, some of the Babylonians used this as a chance to accuse the Jews to King Nebuchadnezzar. They said, "Your Majesty, we hope you live forever. You commanded everyone to bow down and worship the gold statue when the music played. You said everyone who did not bow down and worship would be thrown into a flaming furnace. Sir, you appointed 3 men to high positions in the Babylonian province, but they have disobeyed you. Those Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they refused to worship your gods and the statue that you have set up." Nebuchadnezzar was furious. He sent for the 3 young men. He said, "I have heard that you refuse to worship my gods and the gold statue that I have set up. Now I'm going to give you one more chance. If you bow down and worship the statue when you hear the music, everything will be right. But if you don't, you will at once be thrown into the flaming furnace, and no God can save you from me." 3 men replied, "Your Majesty, We don't need to defend ourselves. The God we worship can save us from you and your flaming furnace. But even if he doesn't, we won't worship your gods and the gold statue you've set up. Nebuchadnezzar's face twisted with anger at the three men. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. Next, he commanded some of his strongest soldiers to tie up the men and throw them into the flaming furnace. The king wanted it done at that very moment, so the soldiers tied up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and threw them into the flaming furnace with all their clothes still on, including their turbans. And the fire was so hot, the flames leaped out and killed the soldiers. Suddenly the king jumped up. He shouted, "Weren't there 3 men tied up and thrown into the fire?" "Yes, your majesty," the people answered. "But I see 4 men walking around in the fire. None of them is tied up or harmed. The 4th looks like a god." Nebuchadnezzar went closer to the flaming furnace and said to the 3 young men, "You servants of the Most High God, come out at once." And they came out. And the king's high officials and governors and advisors all crowded around them. The men were not burned. Their hair was not scorched. Their clothes didn't even smell like smoke. King Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise their God for sending an angel to rescue his servants. They trusted their God, refused to obey my commands. They chose to die rather than worship or serve any god except their own. I won't allow any people of any nation or race to say anything against their God. Anyone who does will be chopped up, and their homes will be torn down, because no other God has such great power to save." As this happened, King appointed then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in Babylon. All right. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't really get the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? It isn't worship me or get chopped up. That's how Nebuchadnezzar would do things, or make these bold proclamations, and if you didn't do it, you get burned up or get chopped up or whatever. He gets what raw power looks like, but he doesn't get is a God who loves us. He doesn't get faith is not based on fear, but it's based on love. The witness of Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and it's not their names their parents gave them. When they were born, they had Hebrew names. These were the names the Babylonians renamed them when they formed them when they came to Babylon. But the witness of Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego was not that if you believe in God, nothing bad will happen to you. Some try to turn the story into that, but it's so much more than that. They were not sure whether God would save them from the flames. They knew that God could save them from the flames. They knew that God had that power and God could, but they didn't know that he would. That's why they said, but if not, right? If we are not saved, you will still know who is God of our life. I find it interesting where God shows up in the story, right? It's not before they're thrown in and it's keeping them from being thrown in the furnace. It's in the very midst of the flames where God shows up. God's presence for them was not a pass from having any kind of conflict in their life. Rather, it was that I'll be with you in the midst of the worst, right? The promise that God makes again and again and again is that we are not alone, that God will be with us. Remember that promise? It was Emmanuel. God is with us wherever, whenever we may be. A couple weeks ago, when we were talking about Amos, I mentioned that the quote from Amos is on the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, and King used those phrases from Amos when he had the famous dream speech. King loved the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as well. He refers to it in several of his sermons. He also refers to it when he writes this letter from the Birmingham jail. King was undergoing some criticism by white clergy about his tactics because of what was happening, and wanted him to quit marching, to quit protesting, to do that. And so King writes this letter to white clergy members from the Birmingham jail. And he says, there comes a time when words are not enough, when we have to take actions. There comes a time when we have to put our lives on the line when laws are unjust. And it calls for civil disobedience, purposely breaking the laws of the land, which is exactly what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. They were civil disobedient. They purposely broke the laws. They knew what the laws were, and they purposely broke them and were willing then to face the consequences. And King said, that's what we're doing. That's what we have to do. I want to close here just with a short segment from a sermon that King preached, just because I can't preach as good as he can. So I'm going to use his sermon, a little bit of it. King says this. He says, "You may be 38 years old, as I happen to be, and one day a great opportunity will stand before you and call you to stand up for some great principle, some great issue, some great cause, and you will refuse to do it because you're afraid. You refuse to do it because you want to live longer. You're afraid that you'll lose your job. You're afraid you'll be criticized. You'll lose popularity. You're afraid someone might stab you or shoot you or bomb your house. So you refuse to take a stand. Well, you may go on and live until you're 90, but you're just as dead at 38 as you would be at 90. The cessation of breathing in your life is but a belated announcement of an earlier death of spirit. You died when you refused to stand up for right. You died when you refused to stand up for truth. You died when you refused to stand up for justice. These boys, he's talking about Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. These boys stand before us today, and I thank God for them, for they found something. The fiery furnace could not stop them from believing. They said, "Throw us into the fiery furnace." And the Bible talks about a miracle because they had faith enough to say, "But if not." And God was with them. Emmanuel.